Welcome to the C45 Association's official YouTube channel. The following presentation is brought to you with support from Sigma Analytical Services with the C45 Association. Sigma Analytical is the only cannabis lab with cross-continental operations in the world and the first cannabis-focused GMP-certified lab in Canada. Our service goes beyond a full panel of testing and also covers stability studies, cleaning validation, formulation and product development support, and more. We have been a front runner in testing Cannabis 2.0 products and have validated methods for vape cartridges and a variety of edibles, topicals, and beverages. Sigma is also Shoppers Drug Mart's partner in medical cannabis by Shoppers and Ecolab's exclusive partner in Canada and South America to run cleaning validation studies for cannabis processors and producers. Our short and dependable turnaround times, in addition to accurate and reliable results and outstanding client support, has made Sigma the preferred lab for many LPs. Sigma also offers support on consulting projects for the producers and labs in Canada, Colombia, the US, and beyond. From method development, validation, and transfer, to support for designing, setting up, and running in-house or independent cannabis labs. For any questions or to start a discussion on how we can assist you, please don't hesitate to contact us. We hope you enjoy the following presentation, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more quality content.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning or evening. Not sure when this will be airing exactly. My name is Tom Ulanowski. I'm the quality assurance person, responsible person, and Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and Quality Assurance at Nexif Labs. We are a standard processor located in Coquitlam, BC, and an extractor of various cannabis extracts, primarily distillate and formulator as well. So we're here today with some panelists that are joining me to talk about preventative control plans, something that is critical to any really processor or cultivator, whether you're making extracts or edibles or other forms of cannabis. Understanding the risks and hazards as they primarily relate to physical, chemical, and microbial contaminants is extremely important. It's also a regulatory requirement. So for the next 30 to 45 minutes, my panelists and I will discuss various parts of the industry from cultivation to extraction, all the way down to manufacturing of edibles, such as beverages and other edibles. And we're going to nail down some what I think are very common questions that both new and existing applicants and license holders have when they are asked to develop a preventive control plan. And I know from experience, having gone through a number of audits, that Health Canada has moved away from worrying so much about security as it relates to cannabis and focused towards the quality aspect, which is great. And that's why we're all here, right? So we're here to learn, we're here to discuss, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce some of my fellow panelists here. So we'll start with Atiya Ferouz. She is the founder and CEO of AgCan Consultancy Limited, and her expertise is generally in the cannabis cultivation post-harvest side. So I'll let Atiya talk about her biography a bit and her expertise and her experience in this industry and others.
Thanks so much, Tom. It's nice to virtually meet everybody out there watching this recording. My name is Atiya Ferouz, as Tom said, and I'm currently the CEO and founder of AgCan Consultancy Limited, which is a cannabis consulting company. We do a lot of different things, but we're predominantly focused on processes from cultivation to post-harvest and things along those lines. My background, I have a master's in genetic engineering and plant tissue culture, and I began working in the food industry in quality assurance and regulatory affairs. I transitioned into the cannabis industry as a tissue culture lab manager, and then subsequently as a head of operations and business development at a greenhouse cannabis producer. So I've had a bit of experience on a few different kind of parts of the spectrum for cannabis, coming from something that's more indoor and highly regulated to something that's kind of more greenhouse and a little bit more on the agricultural side.
Fantastic, Atiya. And you're also, your alma mater is Western University. So we have something in common there. So that's a great choice in school. Thank you. And as well, we have Sylvia Chong joining us. Sylvia you're part of Foundry Product Design. I believe that's another consulting group that you started, and you work more so on the edibles and food side with experience in cannabis and also outside cannabis. So tell us a bit about yourself, Sylvia, and what you do and how you got into the space here.
Thanks, Tom. So I am a food scientist, and my background is I got started in the industry with product development and research. I did a master's degree in meat quality, and now what I do is I'm a quality assurance person for several food companies, as well an independent consultant for NSF International, doing audit or pre-audit assessments. And I spend most of my time right now writing preventive control plans for the food industry. So that's a big focus for me.
Thanks, Sylvia. It looks like we got the right people to be on this panel. And it's a really nice spectrum that we have here. We have expertise on the cannabis and post-harvest side, where all the cannabinoids that are used for extracts and edibles are coming from. We have myself, who's been also worked for a number of years on the cultivation side, but then transitioned to the extraction side. We have Sylvia on the edibles, which are made by using the inputs that we grow and extract. So without further ado, let's maybe jump right into it. I mentioned this fairly early on in a very high level, but I hope that Atiya can explain a bit more what a PCP is, why it's required, and what it generally tends to focus on.
Yeah, so preventative controls are steps that you can take in your process to reduce hazards. Now, these can be all different kinds of hazards. Typically, they would fall in the branch of your biological hazards like microbial, chemical hazards. Pesticides is a very big one in cannabis. Obviously, introduction of pesticides that aren't allowed by Health Canada is probably one of the biggest hazards you have to be very wary of. And of course, physical hazards such as foreign object detection. An actual preventive control plan is just sort of the written implementation of your preventive controls. And we've sort of seen, first, I would say, with the new advent for the regulations on edibles that came out last year or maybe the year before, COVID's kind of messed up my timelines a bit, but it being a requirement, but that's not something that's very new to us in the food industry, where that's been around forever, for at least as long as I can remember. So seeing those processes and having them transition over has been very interesting. Some things that you might have in your process that would look like a preventive control could be your inspection of your product. It could be a metal detector at the end of the line. So it really depends on which control you're looking to cover.
That's fantastic. And that's a great point. It is quite new. We're talking about 1 to 2.5 years since the cannabis regulations first came out. Prior to that, the concept of a PCP in the legal medical cannabis industry was not necessarily something that was regulated or mandated. So it is, quite new for this industry. But like you said, it's just been around for years and decades in food and pharma and other manufacturing. So I guess my first question for you, Atiya, and we'll kick it off here, is under the regulations, do you know if cannabis cultivators require a PCP? Because, for example, they don't require a quality assurance person. So in your experience and your knowledge, is that something that's required and or also adopted nonetheless by cultivators?
So with respect to a requirement on the regulations, there is not one right now for cultivators, micro-cultivators, or anybody with a nursery license to have a preventative control plan or even any preventive controls. We are seeing that a lot of individuals have started to implement these sort of procedures. And I think that it comes from an understanding of the fact that although they're not required, they can have a really big impact on the end product quality. So right now, we're not seeing that it's a requirement, but I say that most producers that I go into have something in place. It may not be as formalized or in a written preventive control plan, but there's a lot of different aspects to their process which are there to help reduce some sort of hazard. I think that in the future, we're definitely going to see a requirement for this from Health Canada. Every single time we see a new iteration of the regulations, we're seeing these additional components of quality assurance sort of meshed in. And I found it very interesting when I worked at a facility that only had a cultivation license, which strictly meant that we could only provide product to other licensed producers, no retail sales whatsoever. I found it very odd that there were no requirements for preventive controls because of how strict the other producers are when they receive product. I would say if you don't have any preventive controls, you're really not likely to pass another producer's stringent supplier approval. So even though it's not required by regulations, I think it's dependent upon the kind of quality of product you're looking to produce. Is it extraction grade only? Is it for flower sale to another producer? But I think a lot of people have already started to adopt this. And if I had to bet money on it, I would be pretty confident that in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to see preventive controls expand as a requirement for not only processing license holders, but also cultivation license holders.
Thank you, Tia. Yeah, I've always found it, kind of weird where in the medical system, there's one license and obviously you could do many activities under that license, but you needed a QAP. And a lot of the people were focused only on cultivation because oils and extracts really didn't come into focus until really close to the cannabis regulations, being put forward and replacing the ACMPR and MMPR. So it is kind of weird. And Sylvia, I promise I'll get to you soon here, but I do want to kind of hit this issue in a bit more detail. So again, PCPs are not required in cultivation facilities. Neither is a QAP. The better cultivators should have some sort of quality system or quality department, just because, of course, processors that purchase cannabis from them would expect someone to at least know what's going on and attest to and assure them that, regulations are being followed and risks are being managed appropriately. I know there's a lot of different preventive controls a cultivator can put into their system, but, can you mention 1, 2, maybe 3, common controls that maybe are aligned with the regulations that don't require someone to go over and above and use a lot of resources, time, money, and labor to get them done? Just a few for our listeners to kind of understand, the concept of a PCP as it relates to a cultivator.
Yeah, and one thing I want to see a lot more of is microcultivators adopting some sort of quality assurance system. I find that because there is no requirement for a QAP, and especially with microcultivators, they may not have the spend to hire on a full, 4 or 5 person quality assurance team, that they're, to me, limiting themselves with the customers that they can have. I know personally, if I was a larger LP and I was buying product, I would expect there to be certain things in place and would not buy product if I didn't have those kind of, to me, those safeguards. Because when you're a larger LP or any LP and you're buying product, anything, raw ingredients from somebody else, you have to be so careful with introducing any risk into your process. So some of the things that I would really recommend that I think are basic tenets of a preventive control program, kind of starting on the back end, I guess, would be things like some sort of foreign object detection. Now, a metal detector doesn't have to be, that's not the Rolls Royce of foreign object detection systems. You're looking at about $30,000 outright, or you could rent one. X-rays are a little bit more high end. You're looking at about $120,000 for those. And I know those seem like very large upfront expenses, but to have your product and ensure that there's not going to be, I've seen bits of tumbler, trimmers are running and scraps of metal are coming off. Things like that, if I find them and I'm receiving your product, it's an automatic lot rejection. And a lot of people will also actually pass their incoming product. I know a lot of extractors do, through a foreign object detection system. So if the metal detector goes off, think of all the money and the time you've just wasted shipping out that product. So I really always recommend a foreign object detection system. The second thing I really recommend is a visual inspection. And that's more so if you are doing product that I would say is on the flower quality side of it, and the expectation that a consumer may get this product with very little additional handling. The reason being that there are other hazards in there. So the definition of a physical hazard, for example, it doesn't have to be things that are harmful in a sense. The Health Canada definition of a hazard is over 2 millimeters in size of something that's not supposed to be there. So things like hair, bits of hair nets, I see a lot in the product. Those are things that nobody wants to find when they open up their product to use it. So that's something that I don't feel the capital expenditure on that is very low. Some stainless steel tables, some magnifiers, you can get them off Amazon if need be. But those are things that I would really recommend putting in place. And last but not least, along the side of your pesticides, I know that it is a requirement for the pesticide logs, but I find that that's an area where the dilutions are not usually done correctly, and I've had to go in and make adjustments to that specific area. It's risky on the side of, yes, you might, test out for something out of a limit that you're not supposed to have, but just from the plant perspective and as a plant scientist, I always try to do less is more, and the application of additional chemicals is something that I think is a big chemical hazard that we should be very wary of. So those are the three things that I think are important, that I don't think require a ton of effort, but making sure that your personnel are really trained. And those pesticide labels are confusing. I've even read some and had to sit down for 30, 40 minutes doing the math to figure out, the conversion of an acre to this many liters or whatever. But definitely something that I would recommend for preventative control that I think is very important.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tia. I agree. I mean, the foreign matter, nothing is more embarrassing as a cultivator or selling to direct to, retails through a processor to spend all that time and money and effort to bring a really nice product to market and then have, a piece of glove or a hairnet or a piece of hair stuck in your product. There is really no brand loyalty in this space as well. All brands are essentially new and have a equal footing, and it doesn't take much to lose a customer for life. So, like you said, small creative expenditures can go a long way at reducing risk and saving a lot of embarrassment and potentially recalls down the line. So thank you. So you brought up some things that myself, someone who works at a company that works with cultivators, that worries about, right? Because what we do at Nextleaf is we work with cultivators, large and small, mostly large, whether they're cannabis or hemp. And we deal with, tons of biomass. We're not dealing with kilos or grams. For us, a typical order when it comes in is 1 or 2 tons of cannabis. And what we do with that is we, we prepare that either by milling and we do some inspections and we prepare it for extraction. We can extract, hundreds of kilos per day and generate tens of liters of oil over a few days that are then used by people that Sylvia, for example, would work with to formulate products, whether those are extracts or edibles or beverages, topicals. And so, there's an old saying in kind of in the manufacturing world or cannabis world, garbage in, garbage out, right? You're only as good as the product that you receive, your raw material. When we're talking about extraction, generally we're only talking about, using cannabis and pulling out the active ingredients or the ingredients that are of interest. Sometimes that extraction can be in the form of a highly refined process where we can take lower quality extracts such as trim or failed lots that have failed micro, or just would never be aesthetically desirable for consumers, but they contain the chemistry that we can obviously extract and refine and increase in potency and clean up, right? So it's not always the case that you have to make sure that your inputs are perfect, but they need to meet some sort of minimum requirement. And things like aflatoxins and pesticides can and do concentrate and go along for the ride with your THC and your CBD. And of course, there's the other part of the extraction industry where you're more focused on products. You're not making a distillate. You're making a rosin or a shatter or a hash or some other form of a more broad spectrum extract, which more represents the incoming biomass. And then in that case, you really need to make sure that your cannabis is of high quality and you're starting with the best product you can. I did want to talk just quickly about some challenges that I face as a quality assurance person working on the extraction side. And I would like to mirror the fact that, yes, we do tend to work with companies of different scales and sizes. And, some license holders are new. Some have been in the business for 5 years that have a much more strong quality team. But, it is often a challenge trying to speak the same language to someone who perhaps is more involved on the cultivation side and doesn't really understand the chemical or microbial parts of the industry and the hazards associated with that. So someone like myself, I'm often screening for aflatoxins and pesticides because of experience in seeing things accumulate in that product as you extract, which can then lead to an undesirable or non-compliant extract that we cannot further sell. So that's always an issue. My concern has been, or my experience has been, is that oftentimes when you want to develop SOPs or PCPs based off of your PCPs, you want to validate these methods that you're implementing to limit these microbial, chemical, and physical hazards. It's often difficult as an extractor to do so prior to being licensed. Cannabis, oil, or extracts have a certain physical and chemical properties that are hard to find analogs for that are not regulated. So, one might spend months and sometimes years building a facility, getting a license, getting the equipment, putting the process in place, but you're really tied. Your hands are tied as to how much you can do before extraction. You get your license, because oftentimes, you do have to validate your cleaning after an extraction and whether you finding any residues of solvents that you use for extraction. So this has been a challenge that I've seen, and I want to kind of hand it off to Sylvia here a bit, who kind of works with someone like myself, who would, she would call me up, her client would call me up and say, hey Tom, I would, I need a kilo of your finest distillates because we're making 10,000 cookies or whatever. Sylvia, what are some things that you look for when you work with a processor to provide that supply, as far as chemical microbial hazards or contaminants? Because obviously you are putting that into your product you're formulating. So let us know kind of from your perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, from microbial contaminants, like what would be looking for is a little bit of history and understanding of the patterns. So what to expect. Should I be expecting, lots that will always be high in micro counts or high in mold counts, or is aflatoxin a problem for a cultivator? It's important to know, because when we talk about preventive controls, the important part about it is that we're preventing the hazard. And so, when you go through an identification of what those potential hazards are and how likely they are to happen. So if I'm qualifying you as a supplier, I want to know what is that pattern? What can I expect? Am I going to see clean micros all the time? And, that it could mean different controls are applied.
And that's great. And I agree. I mean, things like microbial contaminants are pretty important, because in a non-cannabis matrix, something that has water, sugar, fats, things that microbes like to eat, you can really see that microbial growth occur quickly, especially when there's a lot more water present versus like a 90-95% distillate. So when we were speaking earlier, and we kind of discussed what the regulations require for someone who's a processor to make an edible, specifically as it relates to testing your inputs, right? So a lot of the times, whether you're a cultivator or processor or extractor or edible maker, you mitigate certain risks by doing quantitative analyses on your inputs, your raw materials, whether they're cannabis or non-cannabis. For the regulations, what is required? What are you required to test for as far as contaminants when you're using cannabis versus other ingredients? And when does that testing usually occur?
Well, if you're talking specifically about edibles, you're testing the input and not the finished product. And and when you look at that chart, I think it's the only one where you're testing the input and not the finished product. And it's because the preventive controls are based on prevention. So you've validated any hazard that you've identified, and any control measure that you've implemented has to be validated. And once it's validated, then it's your hazard is managed.
Okay. What do you think about that? I mean, to me, if I want to be very conservative on the quality side, if it was me and I was, starting down a new path as an edible maker, I would definitely want to see the testing on the inputs. But what about the finished product? Obviously validation is important, but if you are a new producer, new license holder, and there's a lot of pressure to get going, and you might not have everything validated to the extent that you would like, would you recommend that edible manufacturers do finish product post formulation, post manufacturing of these edibles prior to release in order to have just a little bit more information and assurance that what you're putting out into the market is not going to result in potentially recall or hurting someone?
So, um, if we're talking about edibles, when we look at when we look at the hazards and we assess them, we look at the raw material as well as the finished product. So, I mean, for example, listeria. Let's take, for example, listeria. So listeria can't survive on dried flour. So that's something that I wouldn't test. But if your finished product could support the growth of listeria, then that's something I would test. So I think in certain cases, we would look at, it would be a good idea to test your finished product for specific things. I know with dried product and shelf-stable product, there are some specific tests, like you're looking at Staph aureus, you're looking at Salmonella and E. coli, which would also be in the raw materials testing. So I think if your preventive controls are validated and you've identified specific pathogens that can survive in your product, then I would say it'd be a good idea to monitor it in the beginning to know, like, okay, is your validation correct? Are your control measures, are they effective? But really, I think it depends on the product.
Okay, so let me give you an example of a product. I think gummies are probably one of the most popular or in demand edible products, just because of how small they can be, how they're easy to eat, low calorie count, that kind of thing. But when we look at a history of cannabis recalls here in Canada over the last few years or the last year or two, you've probably noticed that the majority of recalls related to edibles have been related to things like gummies and mold, right? Growing or microbial contamination. So, it seems to be like a pretty simple process in the sense that, you take a cannabis extract, like a distillate, which is very easy to pasteurize or limit the microbes to essentially non-detectable levels, and then you're probably heating this water or this gelatin. You're formulating, you're mixing, you're letting it cool. In that example, technically, I'm sure most producers had everything that said they passed, and there's nothing to worry about it. And then the things sit on the shelf for a few months and are in trucks and warehouses, and then a consumer gets it, opens it, and there's a bunch of mold. What do you think went wrong there? And specifically, how would you address that with a PCP, being in a position where you found that out, for example, and you were the producer?
Okay, so let me understand. You found mold in the raw materials or in the gummies?
In the gummies, so the finished gummies,
Okay.
there's been at least two examples to my knowledge where people have opened packages and have had mold or growth on their gummies, which has led to, I think, hundreds of thousands of packages being recalled, which is less than ideal for that company. So again, everything I have no other clarity, but let's assume everything was fine beforehand. And in this case was probably like water activity that caused the issue. So again, given how in demand gummies are and how many companies are pursuing it, what's some advice you would give to someone doing that, making that product and making sure that it's shelf stable?
Mm-hmm. So if you know that mold is likely, my piece of advice to you would be to implement a control measure for mold, which, like you were saying, would be water activity less than 0.65. And that's prevention. So when your water activity is below 0.65, then you're not going to have any mold growth. And that's something that there will be points in your process where you will have higher humidity, in the cooking process and the heating process, but it's the final product that you want to make sure that the water activity is below that. And that's the whole idea behind the preventive control plan, is to put in these control measures so that we don't end up with an issue.
Right. So one of those controls would be, besides making sure your inputs are as clean as possible and your sanitation is good to mitigate any growth or any contamination between batches, an example of a final control or critical control point would be testing for water activity in those final gummies, packaged gummies, and making sure that it's below 0.65, correct?
I might also suggest that you do some environmental monitoring and some air quality testing. But the biggest source of mold coming will be from the inputs, from if you're using dried flour. So that's something to like you or Tia were saying, the raw materials inspection is important. Catch it before it goes into the product.
Exactly. We're talking about prevention here, not correction. Correction happens after you find a problem, and then you go through that whole process. So thank you for that, Sylvia. So Tia, coming back to you here, you have experience in implementing PCPs at various sites. You have a technical background related to biology, and maybe I don't know if you want to discuss this whole concept of validation, which is very important. It's it can be simple, but oftentimes people kind of overthink it. I don't know if you're comfortable with kind of sharing a general approach to validation, maybe using an example from the cultivation world to kind of highlight what that process looks like, and is it difficult? Is it simple? Does it take a lot of time or money? That sort of stuff.
So a kind of general definition of process validation would be like the collection and evaluation of scientific data. So that sounds a little bit, it sounds a bit difficult and complex just than the definition of it, but it really just means getting information that says that the process that you are using is actually achieving what you want it to, and that it's giving you consistency, because process consistency is something that I find is very difficult to achieve with something like a biologic, such as cannabis. You can cultivate your cannabis in the exact same way every single time. You can use the same fertilizer recipe. You can keep the environmental conditions the same, and you can still see a lot of variability. And that for me has been the challenge with moving from, I worked in dairy beforehand, which is pretty, it's pretty the same thing all the time. I make a batch of cream cheese. It's always coming out the same. It's always coming out in spec. Seeing, even in something like a greenhouse environment, how much variation we would get from the summer to the winter with the differences in light, stuff like that. It's hard for you to validate a lot of the processes in cannabis cultivation and post-harvest because the inputs are so variable all the time. So when you look at all the things that are outside of your control, the things that are inside your control become that much more important for you to spend that extra time and effort really nailing and honing it in. And for me, the process that I probably consult on the most and help with the most would be the drying process. So drying in cannabis is not yet an exact science, but it is a very crucial part of your process, not just from, we just talked about microbial activity. So water activity, for example, is not a kind of industry accepted standard. I would say that most people are still using moisture analyzers, and there's a very big difference between moisture content and water activity. So at the facilities that I've visited, I have recommended that they incorporate water activity. The meters don't cost a lot of money, but it's a much better assessment of how much free water you have in the product, which means that it's free for microbes and molds and other things to use. Getting the general moisture content doesn't really give you that much information, but moisture content is what you would typically have as a consumer spec. Your customer wants their product at 12% moisture. So having both is really important. But that's a process, for example, that I think needs a lot of validation. The drying can have so many, you can result in a molding over of your product, which is not only from a microbial perspective and the production of aflatoxins in some cases with things like fusarium would cause your product to fail, for example, a C of A, or be unacceptable to an extractor or an edibles manufacturer, because those are things that would, I believe, get amplified in the process. Like you can't take them out once they're in there. But then on the other side of it, other molds like powdery mildew and stuff, they don't produce any mycotoxins, but they're not visually very appealing. So I've had to, take product that it's been irradiated, it's safe to consume, But if it looks like there's, little white fuzzies or gray fuzzies on it, people aren't going to consume that. So it might get thrown out for an aesthetic defect as well. So there's the two parts right there. And all of those, I think, are really heavily related to the drying, because cultivation has to occur in a high humidity environment. I mean, you can be a little bit tighter on the control there, but really drying is kind of the great equalizer, is what I call it, for your different cannabis strains. The drying process can really make or break your strain. You can have a beautiful strain in cultivation and dry it down very poorly, and you can lose that 3 months of work basically just in the week that you're drying it down. So I think that's an area that process validation I try to encourage my clients to do, that I've done myself. Just repeatability, gathering as much data as possible, almost overkill on data, doing a lot of moisture analysis, a lot of water activity analysis, a lot of measurements of the room. I usually use at least 2 systems for environmental control. I'll use the built-in system, and just even getting little temperature and data loggers off of Amazon are sufficient as well. So there's a second set of data. I think that those are really worthwhile things to do and won't cost you a fortune.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. To me, having experience, like I said, 3 years in the cultivation side of things, quality assuring hundreds of lots of cannabis for medical clients, particularly, that have generally very high standards on, not only aesthetics and potency, but also quality. I've seen, like you said, 3-4 months of effort plus go into cultivating, a batch of flower. Not to mention all the energy and time and costs associated with kind of keeping your building running and all those expensive indoor climate controls. And I've seen all that effort go down the drain essentially by someone over bunching the racks when they were drying, finishing the drying too quickly, not having enough airflow so that there's these microclimates and climate layers or boundary layers that cause like small pockets of humidity. So you might, have one side of the room that's dry, but then you bag it all up, but then all of a sudden the moisture redistributes, and all of a sudden you open it up and it smells moldy and there's mold in it. And, especially for the micro holders of the world, or where typically they're smaller businesses, not as well capitalized, they don't have that wiggle room. They can't afford to fail a lot or two. And there are recent examples in this industry where, some very ethical cultivators recently discovered some microbial concerns. It resulted in a recall, despite only having a few complaints at the time and all the records to support that it was fine at the time of the release. And they actually tore their whole facility down and cleaned it up and lost months of production, and that to me was very respectable, and probably a huge learning experience for all those involved. But it speaks to kind of the importance of having this preventative control plan and all the tools in place to ensure that, throughout your process, but particularly as you get closer to that finished product, there are many more controls in place. And at the end, you're able to kind of stand by your product and limit that potential embarrassment and cost to recall and make right the issue at hand. So, Sylvia, I'll come back to you. Something that I've myself personally have had a tough time kind of wrapping my head around is this idea of quantitative versus qualitative control points, right? Because it's very easy for anywhere along this kind of manufacturing line, from seed to sale, let's call it, to take a sample, send it to a lab and get a number, right? Or take a sample, throw it into your moisture analyzer or your water activity, or take a swab and, oh, look, it's green light means go. So, maybe that's not a quantitative example, but the others are. But those are often costly. They require equipment and SOPs to run that equipment and people to run that equipment, because again, you don't want a random number generator in house. You want something that you have confidence that it is telling you that value is that value. But there's also a qualitative approach, things like visual inspections, that you can implement very simply on your forms and your standard process forms, your batch records, whether that's one person verifying or two. But oftentimes I find myself going, well, every person is different. These things are very subjective. And as a result, are they as powerful? And I believe you both mentioned the importance of just visual assessments. When you receive your product, you go through it. When you're working with that product, you go through it. Talk a bit about how one could validate something like a visual assessment. What kind of controls or definitions do you have in place when, let's say, you're just opening a bag of cannabis and you want to look for foreign matter? Things like sample requirements and how many containers you check. Just, I guess, speak to that part of it if you can, just so people are aware that oftentimes you can have a really good preventive control plan without spending tons of money.
One thing that comes to mind when you talk about visual inspections is metal detection and physical hazards. It's commonplace in the industry, that we know that metal is a hazard, especially when you have equipment where it's metal on metal and moving metal parts. The likelihood is higher, but it's commonplace in industry to use visual inspection of the equipment as a control point. Validation of that, I would base it on likelihood. So if you have a piece of equipment that is very likely to produce a metal hazard, then visual inspection might not be the way to go, right? So you would look at likelihood.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so how do you, like, let's just kind of give an example. So again, let's say I was the processor selling you, an extract, and you were going to use that to make some brownies or gummies or whatever. So you would receive my product, and you would have a COA on hand, a certificate of manufacture, some other, statements about, quality and assurance, and you've already validated me. What would be like, how would you approach that part of it? Being an edibles manufacturer, like what would you do when you do that visual inspections? What are you looking for? How are you defining those things? And how specific do you really need to be in your forms and training? Because it could be as simple as, I checked and it's all good, but that doesn't really tell you much. So what are like some key kind of variables you would look for visual inspection, and how would you note that?
I think that if you're using visual inspection for to qualify your raw inputs, for example, if you're talking about extracts, like say we're talking about an oil, one qualitative inspection that you could do is a sniff test for oxidation. And so I think how I would approach that is with some training. I would train the person who is doing the inspections to know, so they know what they're looking for, and then do some recalibration every so often, like recalibration of that person who's doing the inspection to refresh them, to remind them of what they're looking for. And I think that helps to reduce a bit of the error.
So for example, if you're looking for like rancid oil, you might have a little training program where you have examples of rancid oil versus fresh oil, and you just say, here's what the different oils smell like, and at least you do that quarterly, monthly, however often you need to do that to justify your plan in place. But that again would be just a simple example, but very effective example of a qualitative, quick visual assessment that could probably save you a lot of trouble down the road, right?
And I might also train more than one person and train them at the same time, so that they're also on the same page and we all agree on what is oxidized and what isn't.
Right. And if we step back a bit, once you have a license in hand and you're running a business, whether you're growing cannabis, whether you're extracting and formulating or making products, or whether you're making edibles, I'm sure every QA person or anyone involved in making a PCP at some point is staring at, tens of pages of documents. And they often have this question is like, how do I know that I'm done? Because I know from experience that quality assurance is is a kind of a journey. It's not a destination. You're always iterating. You're always continually improving. You're always changing processes, which then affect downstream process, blah, blah, blah. So how does one know that they've identified all the risks and hazards and have captured them adequately in a PCP?
That's a really good question. So when you're developing a preventive control plan, it's important to not work in isolation. So when you're, say I were to develop a preventive control plan for a product, I would definitely want to involve other people on my team who are also familiar with the product and the process, and get them involved to provide input. And I'm human. There are things that I could miss that somebody else would be able to say, hey, what about this? We also want to look at what has happened in the industry with similar products, so that we know, okay, if it's, beef jerky, what are the common pathogens that we're looking at? And it's a good idea that when you're finished with your preventive control plan, is to get somebody in in upper level management for the process or the operation to sign off on it.
So, in my experience, and Health Canada does want to see this, and other clients do, it's not only the quality assurance team or quality assurance and control department that works in a silo. When I first did a C45 panel 2 years ago, the topic was, buying into a culture of quality. And that touches on not only quality, but production, logistics. Everyone should be on board when it comes to quality. So, generally you would recommend, right? And I think I would recommend that once throughout the process of writing this PCP, but also throughout the process of approving it, you want that input, you want that buy-in, because, sometimes you might miss something. Sometimes you just don't know there's a hazard in place until you talk to the operator of that machine, or someone who owns that process and has done it 100,000 times over their career. They might say, no, you've totally missed the point here. That's not what I'm worried about. This is what I'm worried about. So I guess, would you agree that it's important to involve everyone along this process chain to make sure that you've captured everything?
Absolutely.
Okay. And another question for you, Sylvia, as we kind of start wrapping this up here, because I'm sure we can go on for hours. There is a question between the difference between a PCP, a risk analysis, and a failure mode effect analysis. And I've seen those all used together or intertwined, depending on kind of some example documents you see, or what other people have done, or some guidance documents. Can you talk about the similarities or differences between those different terms that you'll often encounter?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm familiar with preventive control plans as it is built upon HACCP, which is a systematic approach to prevention. If you're talking about risk analysis with ISO and failure mode effects analysis, like the risk analysis piece is more general. It's a general strategy. It might also include other things like financial risk management. And failure mode effects analysis is a tool. So, feel free to jump in here if you're more familiar with these, because I'm not 100%. But like failure mode effects analysis, it's a tool. It's a risk analysis tool. So it's very specific to like preventive control plans are specific to hazards. What's your take on that?
Atia, do you have anything to add with regards to, a PCP versus a risk analysis or FMEA?
I think it really depends on what standard you're looking to adhere to. So Sylvia kind of mentioned there's so many different preventative control programs, and she mentioned HACCP, which is one of the courses that I teach my students who are taking edibles food safety. I'm a huge proponent of HACCP. I just think everyone should have a HACCP plan, because parts of it are also the inclusion that you need to make it like a living, breathing system and really understand like the minimum annual audit, stuff like that. So I think it depends on which system you're opting to go forward with. ISO is also a fantastic system. I haven't seen it very much in cannabis, to be honest, outside of like tissue culture labs. I think some extraction facilities have been built to ISO standards, but I think that the use of preventative control plans are more common, what we're seeing in the cultivation space, but I haven't seen a lot of people personally using ISO tools.
Okay. Yeah, that's the way I understand it too. Is there a number of different approaches? There's no one way to build a PCP, and again, HACCP or hazard analysis and critical control points is something that you see the whole food industry kind of moving towards and have been for a while, and I think it's important that that approach is taken. But to me, as long as you can systematically go through your process, identify the potential hazards and risks, and kind of give those ratings a risk. Those hazards are a risk rating, right? The hazard is the thing, and the risk is the kind of how big of a deal that could be. Sometimes the hazard can be quite large, but the risk, perhaps the frequency of it occurring, can be negligible given the controls in place. So building that matrix out and being honest with oneself, and maybe perhaps a bit more conservative, is like Sylvia said, a tool to fundamentally understand and perhaps quantify some of that risk and see whether the current controls in place justify the risk that's been calculated through some sort of analysis like that. But at the end of the day, I think cannabis is kind of in this weird place where we're highly regulated, slightly less so than pharma, generally more so than food, but not always. And then we have this kind of growing supply chain where we started with a small amount of vertically integrated cannabis companies that did everything from cloning all the way to making chocolates and edibles, to now we have a very, very discrete, very specialized companies, but then there are multiple companies working together. I might buy cannabis from 2 or 3 cultivators, make a batch of oil, sell that oil to 10 other processors that then mix it with 2 or 3 other lots of cannabis and make a formulated extract or make an edible. So there's a lot to consider, and then everyone kind of needs to assure themselves and their clients downstream that whatever they're doing has mitigated that risk, and it's very important. So with that, I think we're kind of coming to an end and going to wrap up here. I want to give the both of you the opportunity to ask me any questions if you have any. There's no pressure to do so. But Atiya, for someone like yourself who again is more so familiar on the cultivation side of things, or Sylvia on the other side as an edible manufacturer, what are some questions you have for me, someone in the middle there as an extractor, when it comes to risks, challenges, developing PCPs, that kind of thing?
I know one question that I get a lot, but I'll let you answer it because I normally have to spend some time looking through my notes again. But I always get told from people who are making extraction grade product that it doesn't matter the quality of the product. Micro doesn't matter, stuff like that. So if you could kind of walk us through what Nextleaf or another extractor that you've worked at, what's typically involved in your approval process and your incoming material inspection, because as you mentioned, we're seeing much larger supply chains with a lot more links. And I think that people were producing their own cannabis before and extracting it. And now we're seeing way more people just doing extraction and then buying off of cultivators. Yeah,
that's a great question. It's so hard to generalize what a quote unquote extractor needs to look at or be weary of when they're, working with cultivators. Number one, there's many different types of extraction. There's supercritical CO2. There's alcohol-based, which Nextleaf relies on. There's, hydrocarbons like butane and propane. Then you have purely physical separation like hashes or sifts or rosins, and then pressing that. So, and then kind of a combination of all those. So obviously, I think as you go from less refined to more refined, I would say one can loosen a little bit of their quality requirements on the incoming product. Because if you're buying really nice flowers from a premium grower, and you're making a hash and you're pressing those, you want the best quality input that you can, because you don't have things like temperature to pasteurize the in-process products. You can't use solvents and other things to kind of clean your stuff up. So I would say that on the physical or the lower tech or the more traditional extraction processes, you need to make sure really that your flour is as good as it gets, or it does pass those minimum things. Things like micro pesticides are mandated. In fact, I don't know if people are aware of this, but I just want to put it out there because there's always a lot of confusion. So as part of the regulations, this is pretty much a condition on anyone's license. You need to ensure that the cannabis or hemp that you use to produce extracts has passed Health Canada's minimum pesticide screen, which is 96 or so pesticides in the parts per billion range. But that's it. Once you have that clean COA using a validated lab and a validated method, there is no additional mandated testing for pesticides, despite the fact that you can concentrate and accumulate 10, 20 times the original amount of pesticides in your extract, right? If you start with a 5% THC biomass, you end up with a 90. You've increased the potency of that by 10 to 15 times, and the pesticides will go along for the ride. And you can have something that, if tested, would not pass pesticide testing. So the challenge is making sure that your biomass is not only clean to Health Canada standards, but generally it's clean. And I've seen firsthand where there's examples of growing in previously non-cannabis cultivation facilities like vegetable producers, or growing hemp in fields that are adjacent to crops that have been sprayed, or in areas that have been sprayed for 10, 20, 30 years with pesticides that are fine for fruits and veggies, but they make their way into the ecosystem and they persist, or they're wind blown. So there could be trace amounts of those pesticides, and you really got to be careful. But I would say this though, like because we use alcohol, typically anhydrous grade alcohol greater than 90%, whether that's ethanol or some other solvents. We go through, like, for example, our process at NextLeaf is, we receive the cannabis, we inspect it, we mill it. While we're inspecting it, we look for typically physical contaminants at that point. But it just has to pass, potency, pesticides, aflatoxins, metals. I found that are a non-issue. I've never seen them accumulate. So, and again, I rarely ever see them in COAs anyway. So that's a nice to have, but it's not necessarily important. And for me personally, micro is not super important, because our process specifically goes through multiple pasteurization like temperatures, where we flood the cannabis with cold alcohol, the same alcohol that we use to clean most equipment in our facility, 95% stuff, 70% stuff sometimes, but mostly 99% alcohol. That gets evaporated through a large scale evaporator at 80, 90 degrees. So right there, we have an alcohol-rich substance or a tincture that is now exposed for a few seconds to 80, 90 degrees Celsius temperatures, which essentially pasteurize everything. Decarboxylation process, you lose all your terpenes, but I don't think many things can survive in a bath of 130, 140 degrees Celsius extract with residual solvents in it. And then finally, distillation happens at temperatures of 160 degrees. And all of this is done in closed loops, either under vacuum or nitrogen. So in that case, in my experience, and then you're left with something that has absolutely no water in it, essentially 90-95% pure, all oil-based. For our system, the risk is fairly low. I'm not too concerned, but again, if you're not decarboxylating, or you're looking to preserve terpenes, which a lot of extractors are for the various products they want to make, that really limits you. You can only maybe rely on electron beam ionization or pasteurization to to bring those microbial limits down to a safe level, or a level that would pass strict stringent testing. So, that's kind of how I approach things, but that's because of our specific system, and it's very constrained, and we have months and months of data to back up all the processes we're doing, and highly complex SOPs and checks along the way. But others might not be so fortunate. And again, if you're making a rosin, or you're doing a terpene extraction, and you can't treat it with heat for long periods of time, by definition, you're going to have to do everything in your power to make sure that product you're using is good. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's what I usually tell people. It depends on the extraction that you're going through. If it's solventless, or you're not looking at a supercritical CO2, you can't put what a lot of them I get, unfortunately, is that, if we don't have bud that's up to par for sale as flower, we'll just, funnel it into extraction. And I say that's not really always the case. So just be sure that you're working with your extractor, you have their requirements before you automatically assume that no other steps have to happen to your product.
Perfect. Sylvia, do you have any questions as someone who would work with extractors just downstream? Any questions that you've always wanted to ask about what it takes to manage those risks, or make your job easier, or your clients' jobs easier?
Yes, I want to ask about aflatoxin and corrective action with extracts. So I've seen some anecdotal evidence that organics or organic acids and polar solvents are effective at eliminating or controlling aflatoxin. Is that your experience with extraction? And how did you validate that?
So my experience with aflatoxins after hundreds of COAs, many batches of cultivation and extraction, is I've never ever come across a positive hit. Whether that speaks to how awesome my preventative plans have been throughout my career, probably not. I just think that it's not something that is very common, at least not the general aflatoxins that are you test for as part of I believe USP 561, which is B1, B2, G1, G2, whether they're USP or European Pharmacopoeia, you're looking at nanogram per gram levels. But again, I have never, ever, ever seen a hit. Now, I do know that there was a couple of years ago, a license holder working with a company to conduct clinical trials, and I believe it was international. And as part of that, they did screen for additional aflatoxins and did actually pause the study, because they found some and had to kind of assess that risk. And because it was a clinical trial, there was additional obligations that they needed to meet. But at the end of the day, how I approach it is I test my input for, minimum things like pesticides, aflatoxins, oftentimes metals, depending on the source, especially if it's grown outside, because of the the kind of geological natural burden of things like arsenic and cadmium in the environment in certain areas of Canada. But we just test the outputs as well. It's as simple as that. Is we found that a lot of our clients, such as someone you'd be working with, Sylvia, require basically a full COA, full release COA on everything, right? So we're talking about micro, we're talking about heavy metals, aflatoxins, potency, of course, pesticides, residual solvents. So someone who works with on a kind of B2B side, the expectation is there, even though the regulations don't dictate that. So how we approach it is it's hard to validate when you've never seen it, and you can't really do that. So we just screen for it before and after. Sometimes you just have to do that, and that gives our clients and our company and our department additional certainty. Yes, it does cost money, in that there's always a balance there, and there's always a push and pull with the business and the quality side of things. Of course, as quality-centric people, we want to spend all the money in the world to eliminate all the risks, but sometimes reality has to set in, and that reality sometimes you have to balance speed and generally speaking, clients want to see third-party COAs with validated methods before they even purchase anything. So that's kind of our approach. It's never perfect, and we're learning. And again, some of the challenges that I've seen is is, again, you're waiting so long for a license. Often you never know when it's coming, and then all of a sudden you get it, and then there's additional pressure because now it's like go time, and there's a long time, whether you're cultivating or manufacturing, between when you get your license and when you get your first invoice. You collect your money on your first invoice. So I think that my approach has always been, do as much as you can beforehand. Logically try to deduce, understand your systems, work with operations, work with the equipment manufacturers, know what you're getting yourself into. Um, Start more conservative, rely on third-party testing when there are no other ways to really validate. And then as you progress, you'll learn, right? You'll learn the minute you get a pesticide hit. You'll learn the minute that you end up with micro in your extract and you're going, what changed here? So I think ultimately that's always a challenge. How do you assess your risks before you begin, given you can't buy cannabis before you get a license, and then when you do, the pressure's on. So just baby steps, document everything, and try to be creative in your approach. See if you can combine a validation with maybe another exercise, or validate multiple steps in one go, thereby saving you time. But yeah, it is a challenge, and things like aflatoxins will probably pop up at some point, especially as we deal with large-scale outdoor farmers that rely on their local climate to make sure that everything is nice and healthy. They don't have the benefit of an air conditioner that they can dial up or down, and set everything in and make sure that they manage their risks there. I mean, as a farmer, you are only as good as kind of the land and the climate allows you to be, right? So yeah, that's kind of how we approach it at Nextleaf. So
Exactly.
I think I'll leave it to you. If any last words related to the topics we discussed. Again, there's a lot going on. We have cultivation, we have edibles, we have extraction. But whether these are some kind of tips that you've seen, or errors that you see that are common, or perhaps you've been part of audits and you see regulators pushing for something, perhaps this is a good time to kind of use a minute or two, kind of educate our audience, our future audience, and maybe save them a few headaches along the way down their path of becoming a license holder and getting products to market.
I think one of the things for sure, and you mentioned it earlier, is just the making sure what you have written down is what's happening on the floor. That's probably one of the biggest things we see, is people going through SOPs and realizing that maybe you did write them pre-licensing and you've gotten really busy and you haven't had a chance to take a look back, but the process now no longer matches, and you've got entire steps missing. And those are important steps that need to be there in your assessment for your preventive controls as well. And the other thing I would definitely mention is that customer requirements can be very different from what's required by the regulation. So although it might not be required for you to have a QAP to be a cultivator, it may be at a comfortability level of your customer that you have somebody on staff with a quality assurance background and training to sign off that there's somebody there with that knowledge and experience. So it's always great to go above and beyond. There's several resources for you to look to. Of course, other parts of the regulations, HACCP, even the Safe Food for Canadians regulations, if you're an edibles manufacturer, is a great place to look for information resources. But the minimum requirements have to be met, but it doesn't ever hurt to go above and beyond.
That's a fantastic point, Atia. I think people always look to Health Canada to tell them what to do, not realizing that there's a business component to this, and sometimes, and oftentimes, expectations from other clients and their quality teams will supersede the minimal expectations of Health Canada. So obviously the goal is always to be compliant, but you still have to run a business. And if you meet the minimum standard, there might not be anyone interested in working with you unless you can come up to their level. And that's important to note. So, and the Safe Food Act as well, and all the resources related to the food industry and PCPs, I think are very good to kind of look at. So, thank you, Sylvia. Any last words of wisdom for our audience and viewers from your perspective as someone who works with people in the food industry and now food and cannabis as relates to PCPs and managing those risks and hazards?
Well, For a preventive control plan, I would definitely recommend that you not only identify your critical control points, but detail out what the corrective actions would be when those critical control points aren't being met. Because the person who's writing that preventive control plan is going to be different from the people who are monitoring the CCPs on the floor. And the other piece of advice that I give to you is to look at the guidance documents that they have, the CFIA has for the PCP requirements for the Safe Food for Canadians regulations. That guidance document is a really great tool. It'll give you some sense of structure, and also to look at some generic models, like HACCP generic models for the particular products that you're making. Now, the difference between the HACCP generic models and a preventive control plan is that the preventive control plan will have elements of regulatory compliance in it. So you just look at the HACCP model and then build on top of that, like your labeling requirements. In the food industry, you would look at things like standards of identity. I don't know if those apply to edibles in the cannabis space or not, but if they do, that's something that you'd also have to consider.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sylvia. So I think that concludes our panel. I hope our audience did enjoy all the tips right from the people who see this every day on all sides of the industry. And again, I'd like to thank Atiya and Sylvia for donating their time and being generous with it. And I think good luck to everyone in their career and working with license holders or working within the system yourself. It's quite a ride, and it's always exciting to be in this industry because it does change so often, and it's really cool to see it maturing over the 6 or 7 years that I've been part of it. And I look back and it's definitely grown and evolved in a positive way, and that's important, right? Because we as an industry and as a country in Canada are leading in cannabis, and every misstep that a company here does, every recall that we do have as an industry hurts all of us. It lowers confidence, and we need to do everything we can to make sure that we gain confidence and we gain respect. We normalize this industry. And that all starts in the quality assurance department, making sure that we comply with the regulations, we make our clients happy, and we don't embarrass ourselves in front of our consumers, because we don't have many chances being in such a nascent industry. So thanks again to the both of you. Good luck, and I guess we'll talk again at the Q&A component.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.